All right, everyone, welcome to another edition of the Data Resilience Spectrum Cast. I am joined again, as always, by my co-host, Randy Arsenault. Today we have Tricia and Sean again, as always, as our subject matter experts. And this week we have a guest, David Larimer. David, nice to have you with us this week.
Morning.
This week we had a conversation in one of our sessions around the end of service of a product or a technology. IBM recently made an announcement around the end of service of a version of our Spectrum Protect data protection solution. And that brought up a whole host of interesting questions, including what do clients do going forward? What should they be thinking about? How should we lead them down the path of thinking about what the next right thing to do is? One of the conversations that came out of this, David was talking with us about what does the federal government actually do? So David, why don't you give us a little bit of a perspective of the end of life of any product in particular, especially in the federal space?
Well, if you look at it, one of the things that you have in the federal government is actually enormous environments. And those environments are spread out all over the place. You actually complicate that with cloud and all the other new types of technologies that have come through. And so what you have with end of life is you have to actually go out as a customer, go out and update all the software across the entire environment. So if you look at it, I have a area that or some sort of equipment that is out in Guam or some outer Mongolia or something along those lines that I have to actually get to and update. And with things like COVID, with all the other detractions, I guess you would call it, from actually visiting there, it is a daunting or a very difficult task. When you have an end of life type of situation, and all software has it, you have to plan that. You have to go out and say, okay, when I have this, what is my implementation of getting a new piece of software? And what this also incurs is that you have to plan things like security. Then you've got things like, you can't necessarily do this on the fly. You get some companies say, okay, 3 months from now, you're going to be end of service. Well, if I have 500,000 endpoints, can I do 500,000 endpoints and update all of those endpoints in 3 months? No. And so you have that kind of problem. And then you've got other things that has to be considered in this. And much of that has to come with, okay, what is the consequences of me not updating? And so when you look at this, I've got, let's say, I have a piece of equipment that or software that I can't do by the end of life. Okay, well, I don't get support after that, or I have to get a extended contract or something along those lines. Those become a consideration, and it also hits the bottom line. And so all of these considerations have to be put in when planning for end of life, end of service, whatever the case may be.
One consideration I see is what we talked about last week with Randy is if you don't upgrade and you're at a low level, what happens to make you more vulnerable to attacks and things like that? And that's a big issue right now for not having the functionality to protect yourself.
That is correct. One of the things you have to look at is that the enemy, I guess you would call it, is constantly trying to look for ways of getting into your systems. And because of this, the software that you have installed has to be kept up to pace, whatever the case may be, in order to make sure that you're not vulnerable. I have customers out there that that's basically wants us as IT vendors to look at their crystal ball and say, "Oh, what vulnerabilities am I going to have next week?" It can't happen. So if you look at this, security is part of it. Vulnerabilities is added to that. Going out of service is a third one. Then you've got other areas. Is that, again, going back to my thinking, is that if I don't upgrade this, what's the consequences? One of it is that, like Tricia, you were saying, is that if I have a piece of equipment that is old that suddenly breaks, what am I going to do? Can I go out and actually get it immediately? It's crazy how they do this in order to step over or to alleviate this end of service type of thing.
Sean, you're doing a lot of videos on upgrading from one level to another. What are you seeing as a lot of the questions coming through?
Oh man, there are many questions. I mean, I guess for me, you kind of have to divide upgrading into two separate reasons for upgrading, right? One is I want the enhanced functionality, or I'm going to take the enhanced functionality of the new version. Number two is I want the security patches and the security enhancements that come with the new version. And in today's world, software vendors, and this is not only true of IBM, it's true of Microsoft and Apple and everybody else in the world, have kind of conflated the two things. I mean, I almost look at it as if to think in the past, I thought culturally the older software is, the more secure it is, right? Because it's been running for all these years and it's still working, it's still doing a job, so that's a good thing. And nowadays we've kind of gone to this area where no, the newer piece of software is the more secure it is, which is just, I mean, it's a different way of thinking about things. It certainly presents a large problem for, as Dave mentioned, these large infrastructure, these people who have these huge environments, right, and who work, it works, it does what they need it to do, but then they face these security vulnerabilities that they have to address.
Yeah, Sean, thanks for pointing that out. Let's talk a little bit about in the data protection space. I think we're all accustomed to software updating. I mean, we all have iPhones. It updates automatically now. Vendors are getting better, especially newer technology vendors are getting better at these updates on the fly and that sort of thing. But enterprise software has a little bit of a different feel, and I think there's a little bit of a different expectation, as you were pointing out, Sean, as to what can I and should I do and when should I do it? And Dave, I think this also lends to the federal government who they have all their processes in place, and you can't just automatically update anything that you want to be able to update. So if we take a step back and think about, let's make a list for our listeners, a couple of things about that make a lot of sense as to why I should upgrade, right? Things to think about. Sean, you pointed out security, right, is one. And then as I'm going through that process, now I've made this decision. I need to, or I want to do this upgrade. It has new features that I want, et cetera. What are some of the things I need to be thinking about? Tricia, you want to start us off?
Yeah, one thing you got to think about is education, because as you upgrade to these new levels, you're going to be faced with maybe slightly different interfaces, with newer commands or newer functions that were added in. And this is a great opportunity to, as you upgrade, to start incorporating these new functions. So education.
Sean, other thoughts?
Testing, right? I mean, as a large institution, you mentioned an iPhone, right? And we're updating iPhones every what? Couple
36
months.
hours.
Every 36 hours, right? If my iPhone breaks, well, then I can't play my Twisted Sister album at the gym, right? But on the other hand, if my admitting system to the hospital breaks, or if the government's social security or systems break, that's a bigger impact on hundreds of thousands of people, right? So the testing of these new systems becomes really critical and really difficult. And so, that's one of the things you have to take into consideration. How are you going to test this?
So, Dave, I'm going to ask you a question here to kind of talk about what the federal government might want to consider as they think about this. The one thing I'll throw in, and you already said it, Dave, which is important, is as you're thinking about these upgrades, you kind of need to look at your existing systems and does the new technology run on these systems? Dave, you kind of pointed out the flip side, which is my older system breaks, but I want to continue to run that software. What do I do? The flip side is I've got new software. Does my existing hardware infrastructure support running that software? But Dave, let me ask you, right? On the federal government side, what are some things that those folks should be thinking about? The first thing that comes to my mind, because I'd like you to iterate on this, is just time, right? Everything, much like IBM, right? And I can imagine the federal government is the same, takes a long time. So the planning process around the execution of doing this takes some time. But what other things should we be thinking about?
One of the areas you mentioned, one area which is my level of expertise is in backup and recovery. And one of the things in backup and recovery is that the storage that it is on, you have to look at with these in large environments. If you upgrade, for instance, a piece of magnetic media, a disk drive, a tape, whatever, is that how long does it actually take in order to copy all of this data over to a new piece of media? Again, if you look at it, I have, how many operating systems have made patches in the last, 10 years. And so this is part of this thought when you upgrade to a new piece of equipment, to a new piece of software. Like you said, Steve, is it compatible, and how long is that compatibility going to exist?
Yeah, I just received a question from a business partner about NDMP backups that they wanted to move off of tape onto some other disk or something media. And once again, it comes down, like you said, Dave, to the size of those as well as some of the formatting issues. But you're right, that becomes an issue in itself, the time to move it to a new hardware if you're end of lifing that piece of hardware.
Exactly.
Great. I think we have Randy. His video isn't working, but his audio is working. And I wanted to mention something pretty interesting because Randy and I talk a lot about this. Working in the business development role, one of the things that I think Randy and I clearly have a good grasp on of what IBM does and its value proposition to the entire IT community world or the infrastructure world is the fact that they have been around for a long time. They're very robust. They think about the client first. They put a lot of thought into the next evolution of what they build. And Dave, we were talking about this beforehand, but Randy, the fact that we actually think about the ability to back up systems that are maybe decades old, right? And we're still able to do that says something about the testament of why clients may not choose to move forward with their particular solution, right?
Yeah. Sorry, my video's not working. And I also would like to just momentarily express sadness at the idea of Sean not being able to listen to his Twisted Sister album at the gym.
I agree.
that kind of got me right in the feels. To your point, or to answer your question, It absolutely plays a role, and I think it's super relevant when talking specifically about government entities, because obviously they are kind of a unique entity in the sense that they have much longer time horizons and life expectancies and depreciation schedules for equipment and infrastructure and things that they use. I mean, they're not alone. Large organizations are the same way. But yeah, I mean, backup also has that same temporal characteristic in the sense that you don't buy an app for backup and upgrade it every 2 weeks. I mean, you buy it, you implement it. It's a huge initiative. It's very sticky technology. It has its tendrils in every part of your infrastructure and your business model. That's really difficult to untangle. So when the time comes to upgrade or replace or, transition or shift to another platform or technology, as we've talked about, that's a huge, huge initiative. So yeah, the fact that IBM has been doing this for longer than most, if not any other vendors, works to our advantage there, because we've done it, we've seen it, we have the experience. You're not the first customer to do process X, Y, or Z. So we bring a level of expertise and domain knowledge and experience that arguably nobody else really has.
And you continue that thought process and data protection over the course of the last decade. Data protection isn't something that makes my enterprise money. Now, it can severely impact my enterprise should I lose data, but it's not a revenue generating application. So a lot of the thought process in IT is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yep.
And Dave, like you were saying, if it continues to work, let's just let it continue to work, right?
Sure. Yeah, and as long as it doesn't expose, new vulnerabilities, or, hackers and bad actors are getting increasingly sophisticated with finding exploits and vulnerabilities that they can, use as attack vectors to get into your data in your enterprise. If those older solutions are easier to hack, which I presume they would be, I'm not a hacker, but I play one on TV. I got to believe that if you're running Windows 3.1, that's child's play. I mean, that's got to be super easy to exploit. So it's a balance, right? It's always going to be that balancing act between undertaking the big effort of transforming and transitioning to a new technology or upgrading, and just underwriting the risk of those vulnerabilities from older tech.
One other thing that I wanted to, that just occurred to me, something that you said, Steve, is because of the constraints on IT for on budgets, and I want to, I have the same amount of data. I have the same amount of budget or less, but I've got 4 times the amount of data coming in. How can I work on this? Well, one of the things that I have found is that management tends to be overconfident on how long this technology will last.
Well, and I would say, Dave, too, that, you mentioned management being overconfident, right? One of the things that you can do is you can do some planning around this aspect of data, data storage. How long is my media going to last? How long is my equipment going to last? Software, what is the life cycle of that software and how long it's going to be supported? And one of the things that IBM does, and I think a lot of other vendors these days, is we'll advertise in advance. Here's a particular piece of technology, and we're going to support this for however many years it is, right? So when you're doing your budgeting, when you're doing your planning, you kind of need to work that into the budget and the planning costs, so that when that time frame is up, you have the ability to move forward. Of course, people don't like to do that, and a lot of people don't do that, right?
So Steve, I had education. Sean had planning. What do you have, Steve?
Mine was just the whole concept around thinking about, does my existing infrastructure technology support the new technology coming in?
Randy, what was yours?
Cost is obviously a huge one, because although the technology itself may be less costly in the long run, it probably has a more attractive TCO profile, for example. There's always going to be a big initial capital investment potentially up front to do the transition or to do the migration. So you've got to cost optimize not just for the longer term, but you've got to factor in that front end, front loaded cost associated with doing any kind of a transition or a refresh.
So let me ask you a question, or let me ask the group a question. Does the cloud help here? Do they do the updates and upgrades for me, and I don't have to worry about this anymore?
I would say anecdotally, yes, although, there's no free lunch, right? So
not always, right?
Right. I think it depends on the service. It depends on the provider as well.
Right.
It is in the cloud provider's best interest to remain current because they can then get the economies of scale associated with new technology. So they're going to want to do that. And if they can do it in a way that's non-disruptive and results in the same or better quality of service, then that's great. But my sense would be that more often than not, or at least occasionally, the result is a cost benefit for them and not necessarily a service benefit for me as a consumer of that service.
And the total cost of ownership there might be really high, as well as if you did want to move data out of the cloud, to Dave's point, how long would that take and how would you do it?
And the flip side, right, Sean, I don't know that the cloud in and of itself helps. What I do think is what we've been circling the drain around here is the managed service provider. In theory, the managed service provider would want to stay current because hopefully the newer solution offers newer capabilities of which they might be able to sell to their clients because now they can do X, Y, or Z, right? So as with everything in IT, it depends, right?
Right. You're outsourcing the decision now, right?
Right.
Well, that's arguably part of the overall value proposition, right? Is you don't want to have to make that decision and go through that process. You want to sort of abrogate that to the cloud provider so they deal with it, right, and you don't have to.
Well, you also have one other aspect with the cloud is that right now I would term the cloud as the Wild West of IT, mainly because it's essentially everyone has these rose-colored glasses on that the cloud will solve everything, and the cloud is free. I've actually had customers say that. Oh, the cloud is free, so I go do it.
I was going to say exactly what you said, Dave, in another way. The cloud is too new to have faced a lot of these issues, right? I mean, on-sourced or in-house IT solutions have been around now for 60, 70 years. So we've gone through all these processes and have faced them, whereas these cloud providers are new enough to where they haven't yet faced all the same issues. And I have seen in certain cases with like for instance, with Azure and accounting and things like, and the way they do management, where a lot of these technology changes have forced their customers to go through a lot of issues and a lot of changes. Like how do I move from my current cloud interface to this new technology that the cloud provider has decided to adopt, and it's pushing down my my throat, so to speak.
Hey, Dave, what's the general consensus among the federal government around the cloud in general?
Barring I'm not a lawyer or anything along those lines, it really depends upon which side of the federal government you're talking about. Most of the classified environments don't go to the cloud. Anything that is, there's another level of security outside of the STIG I was talking about, and that's called FedRAMP. And FedRAMP has a bunch of stipulations that I have to have U.S. sourced people. I don't allow my data to go outside of the country. There's a whole litany of regulations for this, and so most of the public clouds are not there. Most of the cloud providers, or a lot of the cloud providers, are fast getting up into this because your federal government tends to be, how would you call it? Not only the most attacked, I guess you would call it, but is also one of the first ones to be exposed to a vulnerability that comes in. So from the cloud standpoint, you have to be aware of that. And the federal government tends to adopt these before the commercial side. For instance, in Europe, they have something called GDPR. And GDPR is this whole security environment that the US hasn't even begun to get into yet. And so, again, the cloud is, you have to be careful.
Well, and the federal government, I suppose, somewhat advantageously, or maybe to their benefit, is able to exert a lot of influence and a lot of force on providers and vendors and deliverers of solutions in exactly the way you described. So they have that bargaining power, I guess, which is arguably beneficial downstream for commercial clients, because a lot of the policies and compliance requirements that the federal government mandates and forces on providers, ultimately become beneficial to commercial users as well, because it does harden the environment, it does improve security, reduces vulnerability. So that's a good thing. It happens over a fairly long period of time, I would imagine, but not a bad thing.
That is another consideration if you're going to end of life, going back to the theme of this podcast, is that if you have organizations or data or equipment or software overseas, those what are the security considerations and the updating and upgrading of software, hardware in those areas. If you have to order new equipment, can I get those equipment through customs and everything else in time to be effective when you actually do this? This is all part of this planning process.
Okay, it's that time on SpectrumCast. We have been trying a new thing out, and we have Tricia's Tool Time. So, Tricia, you had a new and interesting thing you wanted to talk about this week. Can you tell us what it is?
So today on Tricia's Tool Talk, it falls into what Randy was saying with the idea of influencing what goes into the product. And we do have an online request for enhancements for IBM. And you can go out there, and if you want us to support a new database, if you want new hardware support, if you want a new button on the Operations Center, you can request that, or you can vote up somebody else's requests. We listen. This is, once again, we take into consideration during the development plans what is getting a lot of votes. So you don't have to be the federal government or somebody throwing millions at a product to try and to influence what gets put in.
That's great, Tricia. And what we will do is in the podcast, we will put the link so that clients who would like to make recommendations can do so. Recently, and some clients might see this, as IBM is changing its RFE policy. We're actually doing a lot of cleanup. We're fixing a lot of things faster. We're making it more streamlined so we can actually respond to requests that come in a much faster way. So if you're a data protection user of Spectrum Protect or Protect Plus, you might actually see a notice coming your way around this, which will also include the link to be able to then go put in a new enhancement request, or as Tricia mentioned, vote up an enhancement request. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. Tricia and Sean, your subject matter expertise is fantastic. David, thank you very much for your insights around how the federal government goes. And Randy, I know you said you're not a hacker and you play one on TV, but I think even one who plays one on TV could fix their streaming video. Come on.
You would think, wouldn't you? That's pretty sad. I'm embarrassed.
Yeah, that's okay, Randy. I think this is our 21st episode, and this is the first video glitch you've had, and of course with my internet here, it's been kind of crazy. So it is what it is, right?
Yeah, I speaking of end of lifing and updating, I upgraded the firmware on my switcher, and it's been really wonky ever since. So There you go. Case in point.
There you go. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. Until next week, take it easy.